the Golden State Killer in California, thought to be responsible for, I think, 50 rapes and 12 murders, caught using this technique. Never a single fingerprint. He always wore gloves. And then, Mark, in 1986, the attacks just stopped. It was the first time in the United States that DNA was used in court to secure a murder conviction. The Potomac River rapist outside of Washington, D.C., brutal attacks of at least 10 women. He was arrested, and when the judge ruled that the evidence kind of gleaned from this investigative technique would be allowed at trial, he was found dead in his prison cell 2 weeks later. Investigators started doing, and I got a briefing on this technique back, probably about 6 years ago. And it was one of those things, Mark, you go to this briefing or lunch or meeting, and people are talking, and you're paying probably about 60% attention. And then all of a sudden you hear something that you say, whoa, wait a minute. There was a civilian genealogist who was given access to the passwords and logins of the FBI's fake account on Family Tree DNA.
When you talk about a confidential informant, they provided samples to a company in order for them, the provider, the customer, to find their family members, to seek out their ancestry, not to allow that information to be used as a tool by law enforcement without their consent.
The prosecutors prosecuting this case didn't initially know that private customer data was used in the investigation. As someone who worked in federal law enforcement for 32 years, Mark, we need to be accountable to the public, and we need to have transparency. All right, welcome everyone. Chief Mark Garrett, how are you today?
Well, I'm doing better than I was over the weekend. I told you guys about my little stomach flu, but
yeah,
we won't upset the audience with that mess.
No, so it's summertime now in the Redneck Riviera where you live there. What's the temperature like there?
You know what? It's for the Panhandle this time of year, kind of moderate. It's going to be about 90 degrees during the week.
Yeah.
It's like, and the usual high humidity, but it's about 8 or 10 weeks a year, kind of pounds you over the head, and then life's good.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Hey, heat wave here, at least LA area, man.
Yeah, you guys went from like never warming up to like on fire now.
Yeah.
So
warm, literally on fire too. Wildfires in the state, typical stuff. You already know. You don't miss it. Mark, today we're going to talk. I guess the best way to open the show today is to explain that we are going to talk about an investigative technique today. This is a technique. Now, if I was 25 years old again, Mark, thank God I'm not, but if I was, and I was going to look for a job in law enforcement, I feel like this is what I would want to do. It's a lot of this technique is being directed at cold cases. Some of the most heinous crimes and evil criminals of our generation, serial killers, serial rapists, being caught with this technique. As a matter of fact, the Golden State Killer in California thought to be responsible for, I think, 50 rapes and 12 murders, caught using this technique. The Grim Sleeper, also in California, I think the belief is he killed about 25 women. I know he was found guilty at trial of 9 murders. He was captured or identified and arrested using this technique. The Potomac River rapist outside of Washington, D.C., brutal attacks of at least 10 women. He was arrested, and when the judge ruled that the evidence kind of gleaned from this investigative technique would be allowed at trial, he was found dead in his prison cell 2 weeks later. So it looks like suicide. So, as I said, if I was 25 years old again, this is kind of the area in law enforcement I would like to work in. I've heard it described as the single greatest breakthrough in law enforcement investigations since the fingerprint. And that's how, what a powerful tool this is. But I'm not 25, and I'm 57 now, Mark. And
a youngster in my world.
A youngster compared to you, not yet in my 60s. But having, a little more wisdom now, I hope. Some of it gained from you over the last 6 months doing this show. There are some things about this technique that I question a little bit. Uh, Not so much legality, but probably privacy, I question, and, um, and ethics, how it's, how it's being used ethically. So what is it? Let's talk about that.
Mhm.
I've heard it with 3 different names. They all mean the same thing. Genetic genealogy, I'm sorry, forensic genealogy, or the name that I originally heard, to describe this technique, familial DNA. And this is, folks, this is not gonna be a technical science-based discussion. We're not talking about the science behind DNA. We're talking about this specific technique, that's been used here. Now, what is it before we go any further? In a cold case, and by the way, right now, Mark, in the United States, there's 100,000 cold case homicides with DNA evidence available, right? In other words, they have a DNA sample, they have no match. It's sitting there in a database somewhere waiting for a match to be made so they can identify and prosecute someone. There is 650,000 cold case sexual crimes in this country with DNA evidence on file. Again, meaning that there's a good DNA sample, but no match, and it's just sitting there in a database waiting for a match. So, what investigators started doing, and I got a briefing on this technique back, probably about 6 years ago, and it was one of those things, Mark, and maybe as chief, back in the day, you can relate. You go to this briefing or lunch or meeting, and people are talking, and you're paying probably about 60% attention, and then all of a sudden you hear something that you say, "Whoa, wait a minute, this is something I better tune into." And it was the FBI doing a briefing about familial DNA, taking these DNA samples from cold cases. And what gave me that wait a minute moment during that briefing was, and I'm not exactly sure what I heard, but something to the effect of the FBI taking those DNA samples from cold cases and loading them into commercially available DNA databases using undercover accounts, right? So like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, loading a DNA sample in with a quote fake profile and seeing what matches you get. And the investigative technique is building out the family. Now, statistically speaking, Mark, and this gets a little bit in the weeds, but statistically speaking, if 2% of the population participated in one of those commercially available databases. In other words, if 2% of our population submitted a DNA sample to Ancestry.com or 23andMe, we could identify at least a third cousin to 99% of all the DNA samples in the United States. That's how powerful this tool is. So what they would do is they would submit this this unknown DNA sample as if it was a person, and they would say, "Hey, I'm curious who my relatives are."
Mhm.
And they would build out a family tree using this technique and then using more traditional investigative techniques. In other words, census records, DMV records, credit history, who's living together at an address. Are there different family members? And they would build out, all of a sudden, they went from having just a DNA sample, no idea who this person is from a case that's 20 years old, to having a complete family tree. And they would say, okay, this crime spree happened in Portland, Oregon. Which one of these uh, family members is about the right age, lived in that area during this time? And they would maybe narrow it down to a couple people and then go out and try to get DNA samples from those people surreptitiously, watching them throw out a cigarette butt in the street, getting their cup of coffee that they discarded after finishing it at Starbucks, testing that, and then boom, all of a sudden they have a 100% match, or as close as you can get with DNA, right? Whatever it is, 99.999% match, and they have their suspect. Um, before before we discuss talking about this, Mark, how much did you know about this familial DNA and what was going on in just not with respect to the privacy part or the ethical part, but just about this technique? Did you know that this was kind of a new thing in law enforcement and how it was breaking open these cold cases? Had you heard about that?
Well, it's very interesting because not too long before I retired, I was still an assistant chief. So this it was about 3 years or so before I retired. We had a case, California Highway Patrol, and I'll cut to the chase here on this. That is still an unsolved homicide. But we had a case where a family, a mother, father,
Mhm.
husband, and wife, and their two kids were traveling on a freeway in Los Angeles County. And as they approached an overpass, someone threw a boulder, and I'm talking about it may have even required more than one person. It was
Yeah.
probably, I can't remember now, probably close to 100 pounds, threw it over the overpass and went through the passenger side of the windshield where the husband was sitting, the wife was driving,
Mhm.
and at 70 miles an hour, and almost instantly killed the husband in the right front seat. He actually died just a little bit later at a local hospital. Um, and of course, the object was still, in the front seat with the victim. So our investigators, obviously retrieved this with a lot of other forensic evidence in there. And we think, and again, this is years ago, for that
Mhm.
there's there was a company that believed they were able to find some very weak trace DNA. Now, again, I'm using these terms. I'm not sure what they mean because I was never educated clearly to the level you were, even in a seminar about this. But they said they believed they were able to recover some trace evidence. Now, again, this was over about a year. So this is probably a couple of years before I retired, and they were working on this. So this is about the extent of my personal involvement and personal knowledge about this. And I did get educated. So I did a little bit of research back then while I was still a chief to find out how some of this works. Um, and later on, because of what came to fruition with these murders, these suspects you're talking about, um, uh, I became educated that way. But I never had any formal training with it, any formal seminars like you did. But I become aware, like most people watching this, just through news articles and news stories.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, Mark, is, and maybe I didn't say it or should be more clear about it, when they have a DNA sample on a cold case, um, and they don't know who it is, that means that it was kind of run, let's call it the old fashioned way, for where they're looking for 100%. I'm going to use the term 100%. I know it's probably not actually 100%, but it's extremely close to it. They're going to look for a 100% match. And you share DNA with your family members, right? So there may not be a 100% match on file, but what is on file, especially in these commercially available databases, are a number of samples of people who share little snippets of your DNA. And by identifying those people and then building out the family, they go from having nothing to having a whole range of suspects. And let's talk specifically, Mark, about the Golden State Killer case, because at least here in California and probably nationwide, that's one of the first cases that used this technique. Came under a lot of criticism. Again, not because, and I'll get your thoughts on it in a minute, but not really because of the legality of what they did. I don't think people are really questioning the legality to any major extent, but more the intrusion perhaps on privacy and the ethical concerns. So the Golden State Killer, this is a serial criminal uh, operating in California, I guess is the best way to put it. Started in the 1970s as what was called the Visalia Ransacker, if I'm remembering right. Now, where's Visalia? Is north of LA, north of
Yeah.
Bakersfield? Yeah.
Yes, it is. It's in the San Joaquin Valley. Yep.
Okay.
So it's probably, I would say, it's a good, oh, 2.5 hours, maybe kind of north of Los Angeles, give or take. 2.5, three
Okay.
hours. Yeah.
And what this guy did is he started as the name Visalia Ransacker, broke into houses, stole small things, cash, jewelry, etc. Um, didn't contact people in the houses, didn't attack people, and that went on until about 1976. So that's kind of early mid 70s. They had this crime spree there. Then this person, or they believe the same person, appeared in the Sacramento area, and there was called he was called the East Area Rapist. And this, Mark, this made me, when I was reading about this, it made me think of something you said when you and I talked about uh, American Nightmare, the Hunsaker story in Vallejo, California.
Yeah.
And I remember when we talked about the suspect, or the eventual person who was arrested and charged with that, you said, look at the escalation in his criminal behavior. He started as what, Mark? Someone who peeped in windows.
Yeah, a peeper. Then we advanced to a burglar, and here we go.
Yep. And then a rapist, and then a kidnapper rapist. So a clear escalation. In this case, it's the same thing. And I don't know what it is. If it's just a thrill seeker, obviously mental illness, I would guess, is somewhere behind it. But a thrill seeker thing, or a dopamine, looking for dopamine high, whatever. But the crimes definitely escalated. And in Sacramento is where he started assaulting women, and sexually assaulting women. And this happened, 1976 to 1979. There were multiple sexual assaults there with recoverable DNA, but no suspect, right? They had no suspect. In 1979, the crime spree moves to Santa Barbara, California. And again, that's, what would you say, Mark? What, an hour north of LA, Santa Barbara
Santa
County?
Barbara. It's just about it's a short hour and a half, kind of different direction than Visalia, on the other side of the mountains. But
Right.
yeah. Mhm.
So this is where the murders first started, right? It was in Santa Barbara at 1979 and after, where this criminal, this attacker, started murdering people. And what he would do is, at this time at least, in his late in the crime spree, 79 to 86, break in a house, tie up the man, sexually assault the woman, and even do like crazy stuff. Like when he had the man tied up, he would take dishes or china and plates, put them on the man's back, and say in the other room, and say, if you move, I'm going to hear these dishes or whatever, hear this china fall off you, and I'm going to kill her, and then I'm going to kill you. Reality was he ended up murdering both people anyway, after the sexual assault.
Mhm.
All these crimes, they linked up by MO. And I don't know, Mark, are you aware? And I know this also came up a little bit in American Nightmare, where they had a database where they would almost like input the MO, or the type of crime that was committed, and they could find similar crimes in different places, in the area. Have you have any
Right.
experience with that, or just about connecting crimes via MO, or what MO means even is all about?
You mean relating to this case, or my personal
Just
experience?
in general, like, because they obviously have
Yeah.
this whole string of crimes, and they're
Yeah.
reasonably certain at this point, and this is before the DNA offered them a solution, but they were
Yeah.
reasonably certain at this point that this was the same person. They're tracking them throughout the state.
Right.
How do they actually do that?
Yeah, you know what? I think by the way, the answer, as far as my experience, is yes, and specifically relating to freeway shootings, because
Mhm.
that's a serial crime that the Highway Patrol deals with a lot, and we have these people that, for whatever reason, they start engaging in these random
Mhm.
shootings throughout, an area or region. And so the Highway Patrol's been very, very good with, about that, with different types of forensic evidence, whether it's, obviously shell casings and ballistics, things like this, video evidence, witness evidence, physical damage to vehicles and things like this, and then looking in databases and so forth and so on. But I think one of the cases that comes to mind for me, Bill, that really kind of exemplifies the use of a, modus operandi, building this MO uh, profile, goes back to the Night Stalker. I
Mhm.
think that is one of the best examples that I can think of, off the top of my head, about how they knew that from San Francisco to Southern California, matter of fact, it's Santa Barbara as well with the Night Stalker, that they had almost certainly they had the same person here committing these crimes throughout not only California, if I remember correctly, I believe he was suspected of crimes outside the state, but certainly they had a strong belief and tons of evidence the same person was committing these crimes. They didn't know who the person was until some physical evidence with the sneakers, of course, was the final straw that solved that case and identified him. But that in my personal life, for personal experience, is say that is the most, I think, compelling example of a really good case management and case built on these various pieces of evidence. The DNA, of course, is, and we're going to talk about this, that's kind of the nail in the coffin, so to speak. And I think it's really important, as we get into this to really realize how much other work goes into building these cases. And I have my strong opinion about what law enforcement did in this particular case, but it does not take away from the fact there's a tremendous amount of good old-fashioned cop work that goes into building these cases. It's not all about or just about the DNA.
No, that's 100% true, and we'll talk about that as we move through this. An interesting point on this case: never a single fingerprint. He always,
know
the
that.
attacker, he always wore gloves. He always wore a mask. And then, Mark, in 1986, the attacks just stopped. And it's interesting. Did you find any information on the theory behind why the attacks stopped in 1986? And do you know what this criminal, what his occupation was?
You know what? I read 2 articles on him and well, on the DNA aspect of it. So it wasn't specifically on him, but it involved him. My answer to that is no.
Interesting. So he was a cop. He was a
Oh, you
cop.
know what? I've forgotten that.
Yeah,
I
he was a
forgot. You know
cop.
what? And that was in one of the articles. Again, I remember I was kind of offline for 2 days
I hear you.
in urgent care, but I remember that now that he was previously a cop. That's right.
And
Yeah.
here's the fascinating thing, Mark. These attacks stopped in 1986. In 1986, it was the first time in the United States that DNA was used in court to secure a murder conviction. So the theory is that
Uh-huh.
he was very aware of well, obviously he was very aware of evidence, crime scene processing, etc. And he knew what he was leaving behind, but he didn't think anything could be done with it. And then all of a sudden in 1986, when he realized, well, I've left all this DNA behind, and now that's out there, that's in evidence, that could be a problem for me. And all of a sudden, the attacks stopped. So in 1990, the FBI starts this thing called CODIS, Combined DNA Index System. And I don't know what I've heard that. I've heard it kind of, I don't know what the term was, Mark. It was almost like junior league or minor league DNA. The real experts in this field call that minor league DNA. And I don't know enough about DNA to know what that's about. But in other words, you could not use that DNA. You could definitely use it to identify a person, but you couldn't use it you couldn't break it down and identify family members, etc. from it. It wasn't that advanced. The way the profiles created of the DNA, it wasn't that advanced. And they started collecting DNA from people with felony convictions and
Right.
logging them in a database. So you have these, serial murderers out there, serial rapists out there, but if they're never caught or they're not convicted of another felony, the government does not access, or have a DNA profile on them. They're never going to be identified. So this might be getting ahead of us a little bit, Mark, but this is a loaded question. Do you see a time when at birth a DNA sample is taken from somebody? When you see the power of DNA in solving crime now, will there ever be a time, or should there be a time, when at birth a DNA the sample is taken from someone and the government maintains it as kind of a unique identifier for that person?
Well, I hope not.
Mhm.
I hope not. That's my, immediate response to that question. My second response is, I'm not sure it hasn't already happened, Bill, because every single person who's ever given blood, or every person's DNA exists someplace in a database as
Mhm.
we speak. Um, in the first world, again, anybody who's ever provided a sample of their DNA in any form whatsoever. How that's used is the question. So I hope not. But and like you said, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here in the conversation. But that is one of my concerns as we look at this particular case and similar cases.
Yeah, so talking about how this guy, I mean, we've talked about the crimes, we've talked about the techniques, so how this guy got caught. Um, I think it was the investigators took his DNA sample, sent it to Family Tree DNA, which is a public company, I guess, or a commercial company. Better to call it a commercial company.
Now, Bill,
And they,
I just want to chime in there, just
yeah,
to clarify for the audience. In other words, they took they they took evidence from a crime scene.
yeah, my bad. What did I say? They took his DNA. They took the
Yeah, and,
suspect.
and again,
Yeah,
which it turns out that it was, but I just
right.
want to,
They,
so, yeah, just for the sake of following the story here, that this was evidence that had been collected through a rape kit. If I remember correctly,
yep.
the investigators found, I think, one still intact rape kit. I think from 19, I forget what it was, but I think was it Ventura County in California?
Yes, it was.
I believe, yeah. So they have one intact rape kit with the semen of the perpetrator. So I
Yep.
just wanted, yeah. So go ahead.
So yeah, so they sent it to Family Tree DNA where they created this profile. Now that's the little more advanced part of the DNA process that like that CODIS doesn't do. Whatever that is, Mark, I don't know.
Yeah.
Uh, and this Family Tree DNA, and according to what I read at least, and really, Mark, I relied mostly on this article from December 8, 2020 in the LA Times on this.
Mhm.
Um, the company allowed them to set up a fake account to search for matching customers,
Mhm.
and they got very distant leads, I believe third cousins. So they started with nothing. They did this, uh, had the DNA profile created or refined, whatever, loaded it into this system using a fake profile, and they identified third cousins. Um, according to this article, unreleased court record, and again, this is a 4 or 5, 6 year old article now, right, Mark? Or I'm
Yeah,
sorry, 4 year old article now.
4-year-old. Uh-huh.
There was a civilian genealogist who was given access to the passwords and logins of the FBI's fake account on Family Tree DNA. Now, that's what the LA Times says. And I got to say, Mark, that does kind of jive with what I heard in this briefing. And again, I don't remember exactly what I heard, but something to the effect that they had created an undercover account and they could load these DNA profiles into that account and build out the families with
Mhm.
it. This genealogist also used a personal account that she had on a site called My Heritage and submitted the DNA there, but apparently didn't tell the company it was part of a law enforcement investigation, or really it was, I mean, arguably a law enforcement search, right?
Yeah.
It,
Right.
it was arguably a law enforcement search. And with this, they identified much closer relatives and were able to build out this family tree. Did I miss something there, Mark, or am I pretty accurate with that description of how they
No,
built out the family tree?
and no, you're right on there. And apparently that My Heritage, they have from what I can ascertain from this article, they have had a much more robust privacy policy
Hmm.
than the I'm trying to remember the name of the second company, Family Tree DNA.
Hmm.
And I believe they were a little bit upset about the smoke and mirrors used to get into their systems or utilize their system.
Right. So,
So,
so that's an interesting point you bring up. Like I know Ancestry.com, 23andMe, according to the accounts that I read, they adamantly resist law enforcement attempts to access their database. Other companies like Family Tree DNA and GED Match,
Yeah.
they work with law enforcement on what they say are sexual assault cases, identifying remains of deceased people, and murders and child abductions. And so if a case fits that criteria, they will help law enforcement do familial DNA stuff. There was a point in time though where, and I don't remember exactly when this was, where I think it was a teenager, Mark, broke into a church and assaulted an older woman, a elderly organ player who was practicing playing the organ at the church, attacked her. Now, it was not a sexual assault. He beat her, and the idea was that he left her for dead, but she survived.
Mhm.
So it wasn't a sexual assault, it wasn't a murder, but the company decided to help law enforcement anyway, which the reality is it violated the terms of their own service. And when it was brought to light, then they kind of did a restart. So they opted everyone out of cooperating with law enforcement. In other words, everyone who provided a sample all of a sudden was opted out of that program, and then they had to actively opt back in if they wanted to participate.
Correct.
Yeah, that's so that's kind of it's a little bit at least as far as legislation, it's unregulated, right?
It,
I mean, am I wrong to say that it's an unregulated?
from what I can tell, and this is exactly right. And you open the show talking about the legalities of this, and I agree with you, Bill, or the lack thereof. I don't think there are any established legalities, as far as I can tell. This hasn't been it has not been resolved uh, in um, in the legal system, courts. It's again, now maybe I'm getting ahead of the game here. Apologize, but this is interesting when you compare how law enforcement, they use some of these services, DNA that people have voluntarily provided to the company, not to law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
When you compare that to, let's say, HIPAA laws with your personal medical information, and you and I have both dealt with this, and this is something I am very familiar with getting, warrants for uh, medical information for any number of things. Um, Not always terribly difficult, but certainly a very, very clear, narrow process to do that when you're talking about someone's medical records. But then here we have something that involves the topic here involving DNA, which is it opens the door to everything about you, kind of including, say pre-existing medical conditions or
Yes.
things that you're so and how this has not been resolved yet is very fascinating. I think one of the things is, of course, it's so incredibly complex. There are so many fingers and branches to this. It will take a long time to resolve it. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to get too far ahead of the game.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of where we are. Mark is the thing that troubled me the most about hey, I think it's great they caught one of probably the most notorious criminal in the history of the state of California, um, with the number of murders and rapes he committed. I'm not aware of any case of a more evil person out there in the state of California.
Yeah.
This is a quote now from the LA Times, Mark. Months after the arrest, the FBI sought to keep the involvement of Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage secret, even from the defendant's lawyers. We haven't mentioned his name, Mark, and I guess we'll keep people can look up his name if they want. We'll just call him the Golden State Killer. The federal agency invoked a legal privilege that protects the names of confidential sources. According to court discovery records reviewed by the Times, Holes, who was the case agent or the lead investigator, I think in Ventura County,
Yeah.
Mark, or
Mhm.
Sacramento, if not
I
Ventura,
believe
I
it's
think it was Ventura.
yeah.
Um, told investigators preparing the criminal case against the defendant that was why he was not allowed to divulge their identity. So, in other words, when his case was for prosecution, they did not tell the prosecutors. There was not transparency with the prosecutors about how they built out this family tree and arrived at the suspect. And to me, that's one of the most fascinating areas of our uh, criminal justice or legal system today is what requirements for disclosure are they in those situations?
Yeah,
Be-
it's it.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, no,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
So, by the way, I just looked it up. He's Paul Holes is um, from Contra Costa County, Northern
Okay.
California. But yeah, this is this is one of the more troubling parts of the story to me. And I say troubling because apparently, um, to read the story, it doesn't appear that the defense attorneys for the now convict here
Mhm.
even challenged this, that they were okay with it from what I can tell. And I find it fascinating, for lack of a better word, when they compare this to a confidential informant. I don't buy that. Now, again, like you said a minute ago, Bill, I mean, we couldn't be happier that this monster um, is behind bars. I would only be happier had he been executed about an
Right.
hour after he was convicted. That would make me happier. But that notwithstanding, I'm glad that what happened to him as far as conviction happened. I think 26 life sentences, which is
Mhm.
ridiculous. One is the same. But um, when you talk about a confidential informant, this is a single person. This is a single person that law enforcement is dealing with in order to obtain information through completely voluntary means. In other words, having consensual conversations with a suspect or maybe other informants or witnesses, things like this. And this has been vetted through the court system about confidential informants and the necessity to keep those confidential informants confidential for obvious reasons, for their protection, for their integrity, and things like that. To compare a confidential informant to to let's just say to a provider, a company that
Mhm.
has tens of millions of individual um, uh, uh, samples of DNA from people who it probably never crossed their mind that their DNA could be used by law enforcement, not just to help law enforcement, but used by law enforcement without their consent. I think that's a bridge too far making the comparison. I don't see the comparison at all, quite frankly.
Right.
Um, Now keeping their sources confidential, um, I understand the motivation behind law enforcement to do that, but I don't see the comparison. In other words, one's apples and one's a Hindenburg. I mean, in other words, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
These are untold number of people. I'm talking about the people who have provided samples to a company. They provided samples to a company in order for them, the provider or the customer, to find their family members to seek out their ancestry, not to allow that information to be used as a tool by law enforcement without their consent.
Mark, you remember when we talked about facial recognition? There was a
Yes.
similar situation, and the guy turned
Mhm.
out to be wrongly accused, where they referred to the facial recognition technology as a confidential informant. And they
Yes.
said a confidential informant identified this photo, the person in this photo, as, yeah, I forget what his name was. But yeah, that's something that, I didn't like in that case, and I don't like it in this case either.
And I had
Um,
forgotten about that until you
yeah.
raised it. By the way, Bill, in this particular case, or in this particular example, if you remember, in one of the articles I read, it turns out that there was a case where there were identical twins share. That's the one case, that's the
Yeah.
one example where people actually share the same DNA, and the wrong twin, if I remember correctly, was identified as a suspect in a case. Now, again, these are outlying, examples. That's an outlying example. Um, but it's still a matter of, wait a minute, I don't want my personal information used without my consent, and I'm fine with this, or a court order, a warrant to use it. And I'm
Yeah.
fine with that, by the way. I'm fine with a warrant if law enforcement has enough information to provide a magistrate and say, listen, we believe that if we get DNA from this person, this person, it's going to lead us to our suspect because of all the other forensic information we provided. That's a different story.
Let me see if I can't make an analogy here with Mark, with something that maybe a little closer to home with you. And again, I don't, well, without saying my personal opinion, what law enforcement would argue in this case is they would say, uh, how we arrived at this suspect is irrelevant because once we arrived at him, we legally obtained his DNA, and his DNA matched that of our old rape kit. So, in the case of California Highway Patrol and the Drug Enforcement Administration, we watch a drug exchange take place, and we see this person put a bag in the trunk of their car, and we think it has 20 kilos of cocaine in it, driving down the 10 freeway now, uh, and we call Highway Patrol Officer Mark Garrett, who does interdiction along that line, and we say, hey, we want you to do a quote wall stop on this car. Have you heard that term? Or a
I've been,
pretext?
I've been
What's it?
involved in
Yeah.
numerous
We want you to
personally.
do a pretextual stop. In other words, find your own probable cause. We're not going to tell you this whole backstory that caused us to target this vehicle because it's irrelevant. That backstory is irrelevant, Officer Garrett, if you can develop your own probable cause to stop and search the car. Is there a similarity there, Mark? Or again, are we talking about apples and the Hindenburg?
Well, I think that when we're talking about apples in the Hindenburg, again, this is my opinion as a person who's been involved in whisper stops, wall stops, pretextual stops. One of the reasons, Bill, is because those wall stops, and again, to clarify to the audience, that they call it a wall stop. So you put a wall between the suspect and the primary investigating agency, the undercover officers that may be involved. And of course, these have all been vetted by the courts. They've been they've been vetted. They have been deemed to be constitutional, and so they are a great tool. One of the reasons that I'm okay with that, first of all, law enforcement agency, California Highway Patrol, whatever it is, LAPD, NYPD, can say no. They can say no to the FBI. They can say no to the DEA. They can say no to whoever. Hey, and we're not going to do it. It's a voluntary act on the agency making that contact, making that enforcement stop. But the other part of it is it's extremely narrow. You're dealing with one person, and it is a legal stop because you actually have to witness by law. You have to witness someone violating whatever it is, committing a traffic violation to make that stop. With the DNA, you have people that have voluntarily, supplied their personal information to a private entity,
Mhm.
haven't committed a crime.
Mhm.
They haven't been observed to commit any violation that would warrant an enforcement contact or even an investigative contact from law enforcement. So that's why I say they are two different things.
Mhm. Yeah, that's that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense.
First time in my life, by the way.
No, the chief always has the wisdom. Um, Mark, I want to just talk a little bit about this other article from the LA Times. It's actually an older one, but it talks about some of the concerns a little bit from using evidence like this. But before I do that, though, my bad. One thing I want, and I said it, but I want to make it clear again, is that um, the prosecutors prosecuting this case didn't initially know that private customer data was used in the investigation. And that's a tough one, man. I mean, when you have to, even, um, even when there's a wall stop, you have to inform the prosecutors of what's going on and give them make them aware and give them the opportunity to use their legal expertise to make the right call in a case. The chief assistant district attorney for Ventura County wrote a letter in January 2019 to the FBI saying that a quote, fraudulent impression of all the methods used to identify the suspect was created by the FBI. And the letter also went on to say that the district attorney was not concerned with legality, but rather with transparency. In other words, there was nothing legally wrong with what they did, according to this DA, but they did not disclose everything that should have been disclosed about how they arrived, how they went from point A to point B. And I think that's a very important point because as someone who worked in federal law enforcement for 32 years, Mark,
Mhm.
we need to be accountable to the public and we need to have transparency with the public. Um, you can't rely on these things in a criminal case where you're going to take away someone's liberty. You can't rely on these things that you're not willing to disclose. Put it out there and argue it. And if you believe in it and if it's proper and it's just, the ruling will go the right way, or the ethics of it will go the right way. Because hey, sometimes there's things that, and I'm going to talk about one instance when we get to this article. Sometimes things are done that are clearly legal, but they don't sound good. And what is it that you and I say a lot? It's the impression or the uh, perception. You know, the
Yep.
perception of what law enforcement did, even if it's not illegal, has to be better. So the complaints that I saw about familial DNA, there's no uniform approach for when this technique is used. In other words,
Right.
should it be used as only a last resort in identifying cases where there's no other lead? You know, I don't necessarily believe in that, Mark, but I do think there does need to be some judicial review, like you said, meaning you have to get a court order or you have to get some kind of subpoena to serve on these companies where a judge has reviewed everything and said, okay, you know, this is an intrusive search, but I'm going to allow it because this case warrants it, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I 100% agree, Bill, and I 100% agree with what you said about transparency. And by the way, legal or not, you're 100% right. I know I said it twice, but I that in court proceedings, in other words, there's discovery. There's
mhm,
discovery, and both sides have to be aware of the evidence that the other side is bringing. I think that there's potential for all types of failures here if prosecutors are not being completely transparent about what their evidence is and where they got it.
right. Yep. Um, so I don't know. I guess the, the one thing that I feel is important to talk about is just the scope. And the fact that it does take, like you mentioned earlier, a tremendous amount of additional work. Um, and I'm looking now, Mark, for the one case where they talked about the scope of the family tree they built out, and it was like, you know, 8 generations. They had to go back to the 1800s in identifying people to
Yeah.
get to the right.
Yes. And I like to find that one too. Um,
So, hey, there's one other case I do want to talk about, and it's because of again something that's not illegal, but I want to get your feel on just how you feel about it. Is it something as a law enforcement officer that you would be comfortable doing? This is a case of the 2001 murder of someone named Christine Frank.
yeah.
Uh, there was a DNA sample, but they really couldn't do much with it until after this Golden State Killer case came out and it went public. Um, there was some collaboration between the detective on this case and a private company, and they decided to try to use this same technique. Uh, you know, just to give an idea of the number of similarities in DNA, I guess a second cousin might have 123 bits of DNA in common with a DNA sample, whereas a mother and a son would share 3,400 common bits of DNA. That's just to kind of show the perspective of how similar DNA could be or how different it could be. So this is the case actually I was looking for. They traced in this case, they submitted samples and they traced relatives back to a common ancestor in the 1890s, right? They built out a huge family tree of every descendant of that ancestor and started going down the branches. Now, there were several branches of this family that they built out, so they used kind of, let's call them traditional investigative techniques, and they identified people. They knew the names of the people, but they had no idea what their DNA was.
Right.
So they went to Georgia, Mark,
Mhm.
and they contacted this woman, and they said, hey, there was an African-American female murdered who was more likely related to them. So they're interviewing this woman saying, there was a murder victim that we think was related to you. We don't know who it was, Jane Doe. Can we get your DNA because that may help us identify the person? This woman agreed, gave a DNA sample, and what happened, Mark? They arrested her son for the
Right.
murder, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I
I
think it
mean,
was. Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And yeah, days later, the son of the elderly woman that was tested was arrested for the murder. So they told her a BS story.
Right.
They made up the story and used that to, I'm going to say, trick her into giving her DNA sample. Now, could they have gotten a DNA sample from her uh, surreptitiously by doing surveillance of her and getting a cigarette butt or a napkin or tissue she blew her nose in? They could have, but they didn't. Where do you stand on that? On using just law enforcement in general, telling a story like that to an elderly woman and then using her information to arrest her son. And again, there's no legal privilege. It's not, there's nothing to prevent that from happening. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'm sick about it
Mm.
because it's not something that it's not something that I would ever do.
Right.
And again, because we're living in this world. By the way, I'm reading that passage right now because I had an article pulled up and I was trying to find it while you're talking about it as well, Bill, because I remember that. Um, it's not something that I would be comfortable doing, even if the law allows it, and primarily because, like you said, there's certainly other ways to obtain her DNA.
Mhm.
A lot of way. I believe it's in this article where they talked about, I think it was the FBI who was using a garbage man
Mhm. Yep.
to go through someone's garbage to get discarded pieces of evidence to provide DNA samples. And by the way, I even have a little funny feeling about that. That's a whole different subject, but that's not really coercive. It's not terribly intrusive. But to really lie to someone, to get that when you have other means at your disposal, and that's what the big problem is. And I said earlier why I didn't want to get ahead of myself in this. This is my real concern,
Mhm.
that it's like when you and I were kids and when we wanted to multiply 20 by 20, 20 times 20, I can't even say it, let alone multiply it. But when I wanted to multiply 20 by 20, we had to do it with a pencil on paper. And then a few years later, calculators came out and they will give you the same answer and more often, the correct answer. But I think what it did, and we're seeing it more and more, of course, now in 2024, is that it takes people's ability to perform functions away. What I don't want ever to happen to law enforcement is to lose the ability to conduct ground up broad investigations. Law enforcement has to retain that. And if cutting corners, even if it's legal, to get right down to, hey, just give me the damn DNA. Just give me the DNA. How do we get the DNA? Then I think we're going to run into a lot of problems because not every case involves DNA. And if law enforcement as profession stops losing that skill to to conduct thorough, detailed, comprehensive investigations, I think we're going to be in for a world of hurt. And this is a prime example right here. This is laziness, in my opinion.
Yeah. I agree with you, man. I don't like that one. I mean, again, there's nothing, there's nothing that says you can't lie to people
Correct.
but man, that's a rough one. And, I would say the toll that takes on that woman is just that alone is probably not worth. She's an innocent person in this. You know what I mean? She's
Yes,
an innocent person.
completely.
One more thing I want to talk about, Mark, then we'll wrap it up. And I want to say that Anne Marie Schubert was a guest on your show, Your Leo Nation. What episode number is that? Do you remember off the top of your head,
You
Mark?
know what?
One,
We got Anthony and Vince back there producing for us today, and they
chime
probably
in.
can find that. But it's early on. That was going to be in the fall or the fall of 2021, probably, or early 2022. Don't remember the name, but you can certainly find it just by searching her name.
And could you talk about just who she is, Mark, real quick?
Yeah.
And then I'll
So
talk about what she's got into here.
yeah, at the time she was still the sitting district attorney for Sacramento County in Sacramento, California, the capital of California. And she had actually prosecuted a very high profile case. I'm forgetting the suspect's name now, but this was a suspect who had been committing a series of burglaries. There was a 911 call. This is in the middle of the night. Law enforcement responds, and they get into a shootout, or they shoot the suspect and kill him. It turns out that apparently he didn't have a gun in his possession, but it certainly appeared to be, I believe it was a cell phone or something of that nature. Again, this is pitch black, dark nighttime, couldn't be seen, and people wanted the DA to prosecute these officers for murder. Long story short, she did the investigation. These officers were totally exonerated. She stood her ground. She got hate mail. She had 24/7 protection, but she did the right thing based on the law. And I had her on the show when she was still the DA, and she was termed out. She won re-election previously, and she was termed out. She's now in private practice, but a very, very good interview, and I really appreciate having her on. And now she's cited in the article I'm sure you're going to refer to now.
Yeah, so this was, again, this is an article, November 2019, LA Times. They talked about Sacramento District Attorney's Office also trying to keep the names of the companies that, I guess, yeah, I would say that's the best way to describe it, Mark. They used this technique in some cases in Sacramento County, and she was arguing, her office was arguing that the names of the DNA companies, the commercial DNA companies, should not be made public. And I guess the thought there is, and she later teamed up with an assistant district attorney in Orange County, California, named Jennifer Contini, and started a kind of a nonprofit, I guess, to try to promote people to give DNA samples to these commercial companies to be used to assist law enforcement in closing these cold cases and old cases. And I guess the premise is, if people knew the names of the companies, they may not want to provide samples to those companies. If they may not want to use those commercial companies, if they don't want to share information with law enforcement, whatever the case. But it's a interesting area now where prosecutors are now, at least at this time, she was still an active prosecutor, teaming up or partnering in a nonprofit with a private organization to promote these genealogy companies, DNA ancestry type companies, in order to help build the database and use that as a law enforcement tool. Any thoughts on that, Mark, before we?
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. In other words, if people agree to let law enforcement use their DNA for investigative purposes, I have no problem with that, as long as they are aware of it. And there are two things. I think, first of all, if they provide their DNA to these companies, and there is there's a way for them to say, yes, my DNA can be used by law enforcement to conduct investigations, number one. But number two, before they use my DNA, then this is just me speaking. Here's what I would like in a perfect world. That before they use my DNA, that I have to be notified of that particular request, and I have to be made aware of the circumstance of the investigation. That's me. And that would give an individual complete control and give me good information uh, about their decision to release their DNA to law enforcement. Um, I'm fine with that, and I think that's what Anne Marie, the DA, now former DA, is was kind of the same thing. I also agree with you, Bill, and what the article says about not releasing the names of the company because that might deter people from utilizing these companies, and I don't want that. It should be a case by case basis for customers to decide how they want their DNA to be used, and I'm totally fine with that. There's no problem.
Yeah, and that's not, you're that's a very logical, common sense approach, Mark, because to be honest, that's not different than what we see in the field of electronic communications, where a lot of times for a specific type of court order or subpoena, there's a requirement to advise the client that they're in, or at a bank even. When you subpoena information from a bank, there's a requirement to notify the customer at the bank that information has been requested by this agency, unless a judge makes a finding that that would be detrimental to the case, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, that's not a crazy that's not a crazy request. It's common sense. Okay, finally, Mark, we'll wrap it up with this. So, in the Golden State Killer case, going back to that, victims' families were asked what they thought about this investigative technique, and
Mhm.
I thought some of the answers were interesting, and especially since they were impacted. Right, these are the people that were truly impacted by this killer, and ostensibly, this investigative technique, at least to some extent, gave them closure and resulted in the suspect being identified and arrested. Gary Hardwick, I'm sorry, Gay, first name Gay Hardwick,
Uh-huh.
who was repeatedly raped by the Golden State Killer while her future husband was tied up, said she was concerned that the investigators' tactics could have given the serial killer's defense team grounds for appeal had he not pled guilty. But that was interesting. Maybe
Yeah.
she says, maybe I'm gullible, old-fashioned, whatever. I just see how this could have opened the case to multiple appeals lasting the rest of our lives.
Mhm.
Jennifer Carroll, whose father and stepmother were murdered, that case had yielded the crime scene evidence that eventually identified the suspect. Uh, was unconvinced. Jennifer Carroll was unconvinced the arrest merited the larger erosion of privacy. And again, these are impacted victims. Mark.
Yeah.
DNA should not be something one Googles, Carroll said. Anytime you are using a DNA service, it should be between you and the service. If you make a conscious decision to share, that's fine, but it shouldn't therefore implicate your relatives. Interesting. So, a victim kind of almost speaking out as an advocate uh, for privacy rights, on suspects.
And by the way,
Um,
Bill, I give them a lot of credit. These two, and they came from slightly different angles, their
mhm,
reasoning, but I give them a lot of credit for being, I think, very intellectually honest, um, given the circumstances of either the, the personal the personal violence he suffered in the case of Gayhart, I think Hardwick,
right.
and then the relative of murder victims, they still held their ground intellectually and philosophically on this. I'm not sure I would have. Maybe I
Yeah.
would change my mind, and I shouldn't. In other words, principles should be immovable, whether you're the victim or not. They should be immovable, and I would hope that I would be immovable on this. But I give them a lot of credit for staying their ground. I think it's admirable.
And here's the final thought, Mark. And again, this is um, in contrast to the others. This is Debbie McCullen, whose mother, Sherry, was raped and beaten to death by this Golden State Killer in 1981. She had no such reservations. After his arrest, she encouraged consumers to give law enforcement access to their DNA to help solve other crimes. Laws weren't broken, but practices were bent. Still, investigation by nature, it always has tended to include a little bit of deception. McCullen, who believes that, that's what she said, and she believes
Mhm.
justice prevailed. And she said, in the end, the truth is what's important. So Mark, I'm going to let you close it out with the answer to this question. Do the ends justify the means?
Not ultimately. Listen, not to be wishy-washy, but of course it depends. Right now, we don't have a violation. We don't have violations of law that you and I are aware of. And so that's where this gray area allows some of this. So if law enforcement is not breaking the law in these investigations, then at this point, I say that the ends do justify the means so far. But I certainly think that ethically speaking, we have to be very, very careful here because what we don't want is to cast such a huge net that totally innocent people's rights and privacy are being violated in the effort to bring a safer society. So I would say it's something that has to be litigated. I would hope that rules would change, and I would hope that things would narrow, that people have to give their consent to use their DNA. Otherwise, law enforcement has to utilize more traditional methods in order to bring a case to fruition.
Well said, Chief. The man with the wisdom, the Chief Mark Garrett. Folks, drop a note in the comments. Let us know, for you personally, where privacy, ethics, and in the legal system, kind of where your compass puts you with respect to using DNA in this matter. Let us know if it's right or wrong. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.